The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Belmont, a small village nestled between rolling hills and dense forests. Most residents went about their daily routines, unaware that their peaceful existence would soon be shattered. Among them was Elena Martinez, a 28-year-old former military communications officer who had returned home 6 months earlier to care for her aging father. Elena had served 3 tours in active combat zones before deciding to leave the army. Her superiors had tried to convince her to stay, recognizing her exceptional tactical mind and natural leadership abilities. However, family duty called stronger than military ambition, and she chose the quiet life of running her father's small radio repair shop. The village of Belmont held strategic importance that most locals didn't fully understand. Positioned at the crossroads of 3 major supply routes, it served as a vital link between the northern industrial cities and southern agricultural regions. The old stone bridge spanning the Clearwater River was the only crossing point for miles in either direction, making the village a bottleneck that could control movement across the entire region. Elena's military experience made her more aware than others of the growing tensions in neighboring countries. Reports of border skirmishes and military buildups had been increasing over recent weeks, but the national government assured citizens that diplomatic solutions were being pursued. Most villagers believed they were too remote and insignificant to be affected by larger conflicts. On this particular Tuesday morning, Elena was adjusting an old radio antenna on the shop's roof when she noticed something unusual. Her trained eye caught the glint of metal moving through the forest canopy about 2 miles to the east. Using her father's hunting binoculars, she observed what appeared to be military vehicles taking positions along the tree line. The vehicles bore markings she didn't recognize, and their positioning suggested they were preparing for something more than routine exercises. Her father, Miguel Martinez, had fought in the last major conflict 20 years earlier and lost his left leg below the knee. Despite his disability, he remained sharp and observant. When Elena shared her concerns, he initially dismissed them as paranoia from her military background. However, as the day progressed, both father and daughter noticed other troubling signs. Local wildlife had gone unusually quiet. The normal sounds of birds and small animals that typically filled the forest had ceased almost entirely. Miguel remembered this same eerie silence from his war days, when approaching armies would disturb natural patterns long before becoming visible to human observers. Additionally, several villagers mentioned seeing unfamiliar aircraft flying high overhead, though they appeared as mere specks against the sky. By evening, Elena's unease had grown significantly. She attempted to contact her former commanding officer through encrypted channels but received no response. Government radio frequencies that should have been active remained mysteriously silent. Most concerning was the complete absence of routine military patrol. Flights that normally crossed this airspace twice, daily. The village council met that evening to discuss preparations for the upcoming harvest festival. Completely unaware of the growing threat, Elena attended the meeting, trying to voice her concerns without causing panic. Council members politely listened but showed little interest in what they perceived as military paranoia from someone who had difficulty adjusting to civilian life. As night fell, Elena made a decision that would prove crucial in coming days. She began quietly inventorying the village's resources and defensive capabilities. The old church bell tower offered an excellent observation point with clear views in all directions. The stone buildings dating back centuries were surprisingly sturdy and could provide decent protection. Most importantly, she identified several strategic positions that could be defended with minimal personnel if necessary. Elena also took note of the village's 23 adult residents, assessing their potential usefulness in a crisis. Besides herself, only 3 others had any military experience. However, many residents possessed practical skills that could prove valuable. The blacksmith understood metalworking, the electrician knew how to repair communications equipment, and several farmers were excellent marksmen from years of hunting. That night, Elena barely slept. She positioned herself at her bedroom window with binoculars, maintaining surveillance on the eastern forest line. Around 2 in the morning, she observed brief flashes of light that could have been vehicle headlights or equipment being moved under cover of darkness. The pattern suggested a significant force was positioning itself just beyond visual range from the village. Her father found her still watching at dawn, and this time he didn't dismiss her concerns. Miguel had lived through enough conflict to recognize when his daughter's military instincts were activating. Together they began making discreet preparations, gathering supplies and checking emergency communication equipment without alerting the rest of the village. To avoid causing unnecessary panic, Elena knew that whatever was approaching would likely arrive within the next 48 hours. Her military training told her that the positioning and timing of the observed movements indicated a force preparing for rapid advancement. The question wasn't whether conflict would reach Belmont, but whether the village would be ready when it arrived. As she watched the sunrise paint the eastern hills in golden light, Elena made a silent promise to protect her home and its people, regardless of what orders or advice might come from distant authorities. The emergency broadcast crackled to life at exactly 6:47 a.m., interrupting the morning news with an urgent tone that sent chills down Elena's spine. Government officials announced that hostile forces had crossed the eastern border during the night, advancing rapidly toward population centers. All civilians in the border regions were ordered to evacuate immediately toward the western coastal cities. Elena rushed to the village square where other residents were gathering around the old radio that Mayor Davidson had brought outside. The broadcast repeated the same message every 10 minutes. Enemy forces were approximately 50 miles away and moving fast. Transportation would be provided at designated pickup points along major highways, but people needed to move quickly with only essential belongings. The villagers erupted into confused chatter and panic. Families began hurrying back to their homes to pack whatever they could carry. Mrs. Chen, who ran the small grocery store, immediately started giving away perishable goods rather than let them spoil. The Kowalski family loaded their pickup truck with elderly neighbors who had no transportation of their own. Elena felt her military training kick in as she assessed the situation. The evacuation order made sense for most civilian populations, but Belmont's strategic position presented a different scenario. If enemy forces captured the bridge and crossroads here, they would control a vital choke point that could affect the entire war effort. Abandoning the village would hand the enemy a significant advantage. She tried calling the military command center using emergency frequencies, finally reaching a harried communications officer after multiple attempts. Elena identified herself and explained the strategic importance of holding Belmont. The officer interrupted her, stating that all civilian areas were to be evacuated without exception. When Elena pressed about military units being deployed to defend the position, she was told that all available forces were being concentrated around major cities and military installations. Mayor Davidson approached Elena as she finished the call. A kind man in his 60s who had served the community faithfully for 12 years. He looked overwhelmed by the responsibility of coordinating an emergency evacuation. He asked for her help in organizing the villagers and ensuring everyone reached the pickup point safely. Elena found herself facing an impossible choice. Her head told her to follow orders and help evacuate the village as instructed. Her heart and military instincts screamed that abandoning Belmont would be a catastrophic mistake that could cost thousands of lives down the line. The bridge and crossroads were too valuable to simply hand over to enemy forces without resistance. As the morning progressed, Elena watched families loading cars and trucks with their most precious possessions. Children clutched favorite toys while parents made heartbreaking decisions about what to leave behind. The Hendersons, who had run the local bakery for 30 years, locked their doors for what they feared might be the last time. By noon, most villagers had departed for the evacuation point 12 miles away. Only Elena, her father Miguel, and surprisingly 4 other residents remained. The blacksmith Joseph Novak had decided to stay and protect his forge and tools. Sarah Williams, the village electrician, felt responsible for maintaining the communications equipment. Young Thomas Chen had refused to leave without his grandfather, who was too frail to travel. The elderly man, Chen Wei, insisted he would rather die in his home than in some refugee camp. Elena gathered the small group at the town hall to discuss their options. She explained the strategic significance of their position and her belief that they could make a meaningful difference by holding the bridge. The others listened intently as she outlined the military realities. Enemy forces would likely send a small advance unit to secure the crossing, not expecting any resistance from an evacuated village. Miguel surprised everyone by speaking up first. Despite his disability, He announced his intention to fight alongside his daughter. He still remembered enough about military tactics to be useful, and his knowledge of local terrain was extensive. Joseph agreed, stating that his metalworking skills could help create defensive barriers and weapons if needed. Sarah revealed that she had been monitoring radio traffic and picked up communications suggesting the enemy advance units were smaller than initially reported. Many were racing ahead of their supply lines, making them potentially vulnerable to disruption. Thomas, despite being only 19, had grown up hunting in the surrounding forests and knew every trail and hiding spot for miles around. Elena felt the weight of leadership settling on her shoulders. These people were placing their trust in her judgment, risking their lives based on her assessment of the situation. She could still order everyone to leave and catch up with the evacuation convoy. The safe choice was clear, but Elena had never chosen safety over duty. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Elena made her decision. She would stay and defend Belmont with whoever chose to remain. They would position themselves to observe enemy movements and, if possible, deny or delay enemy use of the bridge. Even a few hours' delay could provide valuable time for military forces to reposition and respond. The group spent the evening making preparations. They moved supplies to the church, which offered the best defensive position with thick stone walls and elevated observation points. Joseph worked on reinforcing doorways and creating makeshift barriers. Sarah established communication protocols using both radio equipment and simple signal methods. Elena positioned lookouts and established fallback positions in case their main defensive line was overrun. She stressed that their goal was not to win a major battle, but to create enough disruption to force the enemy to slow down and call for reinforcements. Every hour they could buy might save lives elsewhere. As darkness fell over the empty village, 6 people prepared to face an unknown number of enemy soldiers. Elena checked her father's old hunting rifle one last time and settled in for what she knew would be a long night of waiting. Tomorrow would test whether her decision to ignore evacuation orders was justified or foolishly reckless. The sound of engines rumbling in the distance woke Elena from a brief restless sleep. Dawn was breaking over the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. She grabbed her binoculars and climbed quickly to the church bell tower, where Thomas was maintaining watch. Through the morning mist, Elena could see a convoy of military vehicles approaching along the main road from the east. She counted 12 vehicles total, 8 troop transport trucks, 2 armored personnel carriers, and 2 supply vehicles. Her trained eye estimated approximately 150 soldiers, a substantial force but not overwhelming if they weren't expecting resistance. Elena activated her radio and contacted the other positions. Miguel and Joseph were stationed in the blacksmith shop with a clear view of the bridge approaches. Sarah had positioned herself in the old grain silo with radio equipment and emergency flares. Chen Wei, despite his age, had insisted on serving as a lookout from his house near the eastern edge of town. The enemy convoy stopped about half a mile from the village outskirts. Through her binoculars, Elena watched officers examining maps and conducting what appeared to be a tactical briefing. Several soldiers dismounted and began advancing on foot, moving cautiously through the empty streets while the vehicles remained in overwatch positions. Elena's heart pounded as she realized this was really happening. These weren't training exercises or theoretical scenarios from her military education. Real enemy soldiers were entering her village with unknown intentions, and she had chosen to stand between them and a strategic objective that could affect the entire war. The advancing soldiers moved professionally, clearing buildings systematically as they proceeded toward the town center. Elena counted 24 infantry troops in the initial scouting party, armed with assault rifles and moving in standard tactical formation. Their uniforms bore insignia she didn't recognize, but their equipment appeared modern and well-maintained. When the enemy scouts reached the town square, Elena made her first tactical decision. She rang the church bell 3 times, a prearranged signal indicating that enemy forces had entered the village center. The sound echoed across the empty streets, and she watched through binoculars as several enemy soldiers looked up toward the bell tower with confusion. The enemy commander, a tall man with gray hair and confident bearing, gestured for his troops to investigate the church. Elena smiled grimly, recognizing that her first objective was already accomplished. By revealing her presence, she had forced the enemy to assume the village might not be as abandoned as it appeared. 6 soldiers approached the church while others began examining the bridge structure. Elena waited until they were directly below, before dropping a simple note attached to a small stone. The message, written in 3 languages, stated that the bridge was observed and that military forces had been notified of enemy positions. The note had exactly the effect Elena hoped for. The enemy soldiers immediately became more cautious, reporting back to their commander via radio. She could see animated discussions taking place as officers reassessed their situation. What should have been a simple bridge crossing was now potentially complicated by unknown resistance forces. Elena slipped quietly down from the bell tower and moved to a predetermined position behind the church altar. Through a small window, she watched enemy soldiers enter the building cautiously, weapons ready. They searched methodically but found no one, adding to their confusion about who had rung the bell and dropped the message. Meanwhile, Miguel reported via radio that enemy engineers were examining the bridge structure, apparently checking for explosives or structural damage. This confirmed Elena's assessment that the bridge was indeed their primary objective. Joseph added that several vehicles were positioning themselves to provide security while the bridge was inspected. Sarah's voice crackled over the radio with crucial intelligence. She had intercepted enemy communications indicating that they were behind schedule and under pressure to secure the crossing quickly. However, the unexpected signs of resistance were causing delays as they waited for additional reconnaissance reports. Elena realized that her small deception was already working. The enemy force was designed for rapid movement, not prolonged engagement with unknown resistance. Every minute they spent investigating and securing the village was a minute lost from their advance schedule. As the morning progressed, Elena observed the enemy establishing a temporary command post in the town hall. Soldiers began patrolling the streets more thoroughly, searching for any signs of remaining civilians or military personnel. She noted their patterns and movements, identifying potential weaknesses in their defensive positions. Around midday, Elena decided to escalate her psychological warfare. She instructed Thomas to fire a single rifle shot from a concealed position in the forest, then immediately relocate to a different hiding spot. The shot echoed across the village, causing enemy soldiers to take cover and begin searching for the shooter. The effect was dramatic. The enemy commander called for reinforcements and began treating Belmont as a contested area rather than a simple crossing point. Elena watched with satisfaction as they established defensive perimeters and increased security patrols, all in response to a single rifle shot from an unknown source. By evening, the enemy force had essentially laid siege to their own position. Afraid of hidden snipers and uncertain about the size of the resistance force, they had transformed from a rapidly advancing spearhead into a defensive garrison. Elena's small group had successfully disrupted their timeline without firing more than one shot. As darkness fell, Elena gathered her team for a brief strategy meeting in the church basement. They had exceeded all expectations for their first day, but she knew the enemy would likely probe more aggressively tomorrow. The psychological advantage of mystery and uncertainty wouldn't last forever. Elena looked around at her small band of defenders, her disabled father who had volunteered despite his limitations, an elderly blacksmith who had given up his chance to evacuate, a young electrician who understood the bigger picture, a teenager with hunting skills, and an old man who preferred to die fighting rather than live as a refugee. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight Elena felt a fierce pride in what they had accomplished. Against overwhelming odds, 6 ordinary people had managed to delay a military force 50 times their size. The war's outcome might still hang in the balance, but at least they were fighting back. The second day began with the rumble of additional enemy vehicles arriving from the east. Elena watched from her concealed observation post as the enemy force nearly doubled in size, bringing their total strength to approximately 280 soldiers with heavy equipment, including mortars and armored vehicles. The enemy commander was clearly taking no chances after yesterday's mysterious resistance. Elena realized that her strategy needed to evolve. The psychological warfare had bought valuable time, but a force this size would eventually discover that only 6 people were opposing them. She needed to transition from deception to actual tactical action while her small group still maintained the element of surprise. The enemy had established their command post in the town Hall and positioned guards at key locations throughout the village. Most importantly, they had placed a heavy guard on the bridge while engineers continued inspecting it for potential sabotage. Elena counted at least 40 soldiers dedicated to bridge security alone. During her morning reconnaissance, Elena noticed something that sparked a dangerous idea. The enemy had positioned their main fuel depot in the school parking lot, apparently considering it safer than leaving it with the vehicles. Several large fuel trucks were parked there with minimal security, protected by only 6 guards who seemed more concerned about threats from the forest than from within the village itself. Elena called a strategy meeting in the church basement, where her team had been hiding during daylight hours. She outlined her observations and proposed a bold plan that would require splitting their already tiny force. The fuel depot presented an opportunity to cause significant damage, but attacking it would require exposing themselves to enormous risk. Miguel immediately volunteered for the most dangerous part of the mission. Despite his disability, he argued that his military experience made him the best choice for setting charges on the fuel trucks. Elena initially objected, but her father's determination and tactical knowledge made his argument compelling. Joseph revealed that he had been secretly preparing for exactly this type of mission. Using materials from his blacksmith shop, he had crafted several improvised explosive devices using techniques learned during his own military service decades earlier. The devices weren't sophisticated, but they would be sufficient to ignite fuel trucks if properly placed. Sarah reported that she had successfully tapped into enemy radio communications and learned crucial intelligence. The enemy force was under pressure from higher command to complete their bridge crossing and continue their advance. Delays were causing problems for other units that depended on this route for supply and reinforcement. Elena made the difficult decision to proceed with the fuel depot attack. She would lead the assault with Miguel and Joseph, while Thomas, Sarah, and Chenwei provided overwatch and distraction from other positions. The attack would happen at dusk when changing guard shifts created brief windows of opportunity. As afternoon wore on, Elena felt the weight of leadership more heavily than ever before. She was about to lead her father and friends into a mission that had a high probability of ending in their deaths. The rational part of her mind questioned whether holding this village was worth such enormous personal risk. However, Elena's doubts were resolved when Sarah intercepted enemy communications revealing their true strategic situation. The bridge at Belmont was not just important for this particular advance, but served as a crucial link for reinforcing enemy positions across a 200-mile front. Holding or destroying this crossing could affect the outcome of battles involving thousands of soldiers. Elena spent the late afternoon conducting final reconnaissance and refining their attack plan. The fuel depot was positioned approximately 300 yards from the church, requiring them to cross open ground while avoiding enemy patrols. Once there, they would have perhaps 10 minutes to place charges and escape before guards discovered the breach. The enemy guards followed a predictable patrol pattern, switching positions every 2 hours. Elena identified a brief window during the shift change when the eastern approach to the school would be momentarily unobserved. The timing would have to be perfect, with no margin for error or hesitation. As dusk approached, Elena gathered her assault team for final preparations. Miguel had strapped Joseph's improvised explosives to his body. Hidden beneath a loose jacket, Joseph carried tools and backup charges in case the primary devices failed. Elena would provide security and ensure their escape route remained clear. The 3 defenders moved out through the church's back entrance, staying low and using buildings for concealment as they approached the school. Elena's heart pounded as they crossed the final stretch of open ground, expecting at any moment to hear shouts of alarm or gunfire. They reached the fuel depot during the guard shift change exactly as planned. Miguel immediately began placing charges on the 3 largest fuel trucks, while Joseph worked on the backup vehicles. Elena maintained overwatch, her rifle ready to engage any guards who might discover their presence. Everything proceeded smoothly until a guard returned early from his break, walking directly toward Miguel's position. Elena had perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether their mission succeeded or failed catastrophically. She could fire on the guard, alerting the entire enemy force to their presence, or allow him to discover Miguel and potentially capture or kill her father. Elena chose action over caution. Her single rifle shot dropped the guard silently, but she knew they now had only minutes before his absence was noticed. She signaled frantically for Miguel and Joseph to complete their work immediately. Miguel finished placing the last charge just as shouts erupted from the direction of the town hall. Enemy soldiers had discovered the dead guard and were beginning to search the area. Elena's team had perhaps 60 seconds to reach minimum safe distance before the charges detonated. The three defenders ran desperately toward the tree line, abandoning all attempts at stealth in favor of speed. Behind them, Elena could hear enemy soldiers spreading out in pursuit, their voices growing closer with each passing second. They were still 50 yards from cover when the first explosion lit up the evening sky. The fuel depot erupted in a massive fireball that illuminated the entire village and sent a mushroom cloud of black smoke rising into the darkening sky. Secondary explosions followed as additional fuel tanks caught fire, creating an inferno that could be seen for miles in every direction. Elena, Miguel, and Joseph were knocked down by the blast wave but quickly struggled back to their feet. The explosion had caused such chaos among enemy forces that pursuit temporarily ceased as soldiers rushed to fight the fires and secure their remaining equipment. The three saboteurs reached the safety of the forest as enemy reinforcements arrived to assess the damage. Elena estimated they had destroyed at least 10,000 gallons of fuel in several vehicles, significantly hampering enemy mobility and logistics. More importantly, they had announced to the world that Belmont was still defended and still fighting. The morning after the fuel depot explosion brought a changed atmosphere to Belmont. Enemy forces were no longer treating the village as a minor obstacle to be brushed aside. Elena observed through binoculars as they established proper defensive positions, set up machine gun nests, and began systematically searching every building for the resistance fighters who had humiliated them the previous evening. Elena's small group had spent the night in a concealed cave system that Thomas knew from his hunting expeditions. The natural hiding place was located about 2 miles from the village, connected to the area by game trails that were nearly invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. From this base, they could observe enemy movements while remaining completely hidden. Sarah's radio intercepts revealed that the enemy commander was facing severe pressure from his superiors. The destruction of the fuel depot had delayed their advance by at least 24 hours, disrupting carefully coordinated attacks across multiple fronts. Higher command was demanding immediate progress, but the local commander was now convinced he faced a significant resistance force. Elena realized that their success had created both opportunity and danger. The enemy was committed to finding and eliminating them, which meant increased patrols and more aggressive tactics. However, their defensive posture also meant they were no longer advancing rapidly toward other strategic objectives. During her morning reconnaissance, Elena made a disturbing discovery. Enemy engineers had begun installing permanent defensive positions around the bridge, including concrete barriers and weapon emplacements. They were transforming Belmont from a temporary crossing point into a fortified stronghold that could control the region indefinitely. Elena called her team together to discuss their increasingly desperate situation. They had achieved their initial goal of delaying enemy advance, but now faced the possibility that their actions would result in permanent enemy control of the strategic crossing. The bridge needed to be destroyed before it could be fully fortified. Miguel studied the bridge structure carefully through binoculars, drawing on his engineering knowledge from his military service. The old stone bridge was solidly built, but it had 2 potential weak points where the central supports met the riverbank. Properly placed charges could collapse the entire structure into the river. Joseph admitted that his remaining explosives were insufficient for such a massive undertaking. Destroying the bridge would require military-grade demolitions or a much larger quantity of improvised devices than they could manufacture with available materials. Elena felt frustration building as she contemplated their limited options. Thomas surprised everyone by suggesting an alternative approach. He had noticed that the enemy was using the village's electrical system to power their communications equipment and defensive positions. If they could overload the system catastrophically, they might be able to destroy enemy equipment while creating confusion for a bridge assault. Sarah immediately grasped the potential of Thomas's idea. The village electrical system was connected to an old transformer station about half a mile upstream from the bridge. If they could modify the transformer to create a massive power surge, they could potentially destroy all enemy electronics simultaneously while creating a spectacular distraction. Elena weighed the risks and benefits of this new plan. It would require Sarah to expose herself in broad daylight to reach the transformer station and make complex modifications under time pressure. Meanwhile, the rest of the team would need to position themselves for an immediate assault on the bridge, while enemy forces were dealing with the electrical catastrophe. The plan was approved, but Elena insisted on modifications to improve their chances of survival. Instead of a single coordinated attack, they would execute a series of smaller actions designed to maximize confusion and prevent enemy forces from responding effectively. Sarah would begin by creating small electrical failures throughout the village, making the final transformer explosion appear to be the culmination of systemic problems rather than sabotage. Thomas would provide overwatch for Sarah while preparing to attack enemy communications equipment during the main electrical assault. Elena, Miguel, and Joseph would position themselves near the bridge with whatever explosives remained, ready to attack the structure itself during the chaos following the power surge. Even if they couldn't completely destroy the bridge, they might be able to damage it sufficiently to prevent heavy vehicle traffic. As afternoon approached, Elena felt the familiar pre-combat tension building in her stomach. This would likely be their final action as a unified team. The plan was too complex and too dependent on perfect timing for everyone to survive its execution. Sarah departed first, moving carefully through the forest toward the transformer station. Elena watched her disappear into the tree line and said a silent prayer for the young woman who had volunteered for the most technically demanding part of their mission. The first sign of Sarah's success came when lights began flickering in enemy positions throughout the village. Small electrical failures created minor confusion as enemy soldiers checked their equipment and reported problems to their command post. Elena could see officers becoming increasingly agitated as multiple systems experienced unexplained malfunctions. At exactly 3:47 p.m., Sarah triggered the main transformer explosion. The blast was smaller than the previous night's fuel depot explosion, but its effects were far more dramatic. Every electrical device in the village died simultaneously, plunging enemy communications into chaos and destroying their night vision equipment. Elena immediately led Miguel and Joseph toward the bridge, moving rapidly while enemy forces were still reacting to the sudden loss of all electrical power. They reached the bridge approaches just as enemy soldiers were beginning to organize manual communication systems to replace their destroyed radios. The bridge assault was brief, but fierce. Elena's team managed to place their remaining explosives on one of the critical support points that Miguel had identified. The charges were insufficient to collapse the entire structure, but they created significant damage that would require major repairs before heavy vehicles could safely cross. Enemy forces responded quickly once they recovered from the electrical attack. Elena's team found themselves pinned down near the bridge with limited ammunition and no escape route back to their forest hideout. The situation appeared hopeless until Thomas created a diversion by attacking enemy positions from an unexpected direction. Elena realized that their mission had fundamentally changed. They were no longer conducting guerrilla warfare against an advancing enemy force. They were now fighting a desperate last stand against overwhelming odds. With little hope of survival, but determined to exact maximum cost for their defeat. As darkness fell and enemy forces tightened their encirclement, Elena gathered her remaining team members for what might be their final tactical discussion. They had achieved far more than anyone could have expected from 6 ordinary villagers, but their war was far from over. Elena's radio crackled to life just after midnight, with a transmission that changed everything. The voice speaking was her former commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Harrison, calling on emergency frequencies that Elena had monitored throughout their resistance campaign. Harrison's message was brief but electrifying. Allied forces were launching a coordinated counteroffensive at dawn, and Belmont was designated as a primary objective. Elena could hardly believe what she was hearing. For 3 days, she had assumed that her small group was fighting alone, while military forces concentrated on defending major cities. The discovery that their actions had been monitored and that relief was coming felt almost too good to be true. Colonel Harrison's transmission continued with specific tactical instructions. Allied reconnaissance had been tracking the enemy concentration at Belmont, noting how a small resistance force had successfully delayed and disrupted a much larger enemy unit. Military planners had decided to capitalize on this situation by launching a surprise attack while enemy forces were still dealing with the bridge damage and electrical system failures. Elena was ordered to maintain her current position and provide targeting information for incoming Allied forces. Her team's intimate knowledge of enemy positions and recent battle damage would be crucial for coordinating the attack. Sarah was specifically requested to attempt restoration of communications equipment to serve as a forward observation post. The news transformed Elena's tactical situation completely. Instead of planning a desperate last stand, she was now coordinating with incoming Allied forces for a combined assault. Her small team had evolved from refugees to guerrilla fighters to forward observers for a major military operation. Elena gathered her team in their concealed position near the damaged bridge. Everyone was exhausted from 3 days of constant tension and minimal sleep. But the prospect of Allied support energized them beyond anything she had thought possible. Miguel actually smiled for the first time. Since the crisis began, Sarah immediately began working on rigging a temporary communication system using salvaged equipment from the destroyed village electrical grid. Her technical skills, which had seemed almost irrelevant when they first decided to stay and fight, now proved to be exactly what Allied forces needed to coordinate their attack. Thomas reported that he had observed increased enemy activity during the night. Patrols were more frequent and guards appeared nervous, suggesting that enemy commanders were also aware that something significant was about to happen. Several times he had seen officers examining maps and conducting what appeared to be contingency planning meetings. Elena used the pre-dawn hours to conduct detailed reconnaissance of current enemy positions. The forces that had originally numbered around 280 soldiers had been reinforced during the night to nearly 400 troops. However, their positioning was now defensive rather than offensive, focused on holding the village rather than continuing their advance. The enemy had made significant tactical errors in responding to the resistance campaign. By concentrating so many troops in one location, they had created an attractive target for Allied counterattack while weakening their forces elsewhere. Elena realized that their small group had not only delayed enemy advance, but had actually lured them into a strategic trap. At 5:30 a.m., Elena established radio contact with the incoming Allied force. She was amazed to learn that the counteroffensive involved over 200 soldiers supported by armored vehicles and artillery. What had begun as a small village defense was about to become a major battle that could affect the entire regional campaign. Elena provided detailed intelligence about enemy positions, defensive preparations, and the extent of damage to local infrastructure. Her information was particularly valuable regarding the bridge, where enemy engineers had been working frantically to complete repairs that would allow their heavy vehicles to continue advancing. Colonel Harrison personally acknowledged Elena's reports and commended her team for their exceptional performance under impossible circumstances. The colonel explained that their resistance had provided military planners with crucial time to organize the counteroffensive and had forced enemy forces to commit resources that were badly needed elsewhere. As dawn broke, Elena positioned her team to serve as forward observers, while staying clear of the approaching battle zone. From their concealed position, they had excellent views of both enemy defensive positions and the routes that Allied forces would use for their assault. The Allied attack began with a devastating artillery barrage that targeted enemy positions throughout the village. Elena watched with grim satisfaction as carefully plotted coordinates resulted in direct hits on the command post, ammunition depot, and vehicle park. The enemy force that had seemed so overwhelming when facing 6 defenders was now experiencing the full weight of professional military assault. Enemy forces responded as well as could be expected under the circumstances, but they were clearly unprepared for the scale and intensity of the Allied attack. Their defensive positions had been designed to counter small-scale resistance, not a coordinated assault by combined arms forces including tanks and artillery. Elena provided real-time targeting updates as the battle progressed, identifying enemy positions that were causing problems for advancing Allied units. Her team's knowledge of the village layout and recent enemy modifications proved invaluable for directing supporting fire and avoiding friendly fire incidents. The battle for Belmont lasted 6 hours, but the outcome was determined within the first 30 minutes. Enemy forces found themselves surrounded and under attack from multiple directions, with their command structure disrupted and their escape routes blocked by the same river that had made the bridge so strategically valuable. By noon, enemy resistance had collapsed completely. Elena watched through binoculars as hundreds of enemy soldiers surrendered to advancing Allied forces. The bridge that had been the focus of so much fighting was finally secured, but not by the forces that had originally planned to control it. Elena's small team emerged from their concealment to find themselves celebrities among the Allied soldiers. Word had spread throughout the attacking force about the 6 villagers who had held off an enemy division for 3 days, using nothing but courage, ingenuity, and intimate knowledge of their home terrain. Colonel Harrison met Elena personally as Allied forces completed their sweep of the village. The colonel was a stern woman in her 50s who had commanded respect throughout her military career, but she looked genuinely moved as she shook hands with each member of Elena's team. The colonel explained that their resistance had accomplished far more than they realized. By forcing enemy forces to concentrate at Belmont, they had weakened enemy positions across a 50-mile front. Allied forces had exploited these weaknesses to launch successful attacks in 3 other locations, fundamentally altering the strategic balance of the entire campaign. Elena learned that military intelligence had been monitoring their radio transmissions and observing the battle through satellite reconnaissance. Their tactics and determination had impressed professional soldiers who understood exactly how impossible their situation had been. Several officers admitted they wouldn't have believed the reports if they hadn't seen the evidence firsthand. The damage assessment revealed the true extent of their impact. Enemy forces had lost over 80 vehicles, thousands of gallons of fuel, significant communications equipment, and most importantly, 72 hours of operational time during a critical phase of their campaign. The delay had allowed Allied forces to reposition and coordinate the counteroffensive that was now pushing enemy forces back across the border. Miguel was treated by military medics for exhaustion and a minor injury from the bridge assault, but he insisted on remaining with his daughter to see the mission completed. Joseph received recognition for his improvised explosives, which had performed far better than military engineers had expected from civilian-manufactured devices. Sarah's technical expertise impressed Allied communications specialists, who offered her immediate enlistment with advanced rank if she was interested in military service. Thomas's knowledge of local terrain proved valuable for planning pursuit operations against retreating enemy forces. Chen Wei, the elderly man who had refused evacuation, became something of a legend among the soldiers. His quiet determination to defend his home rather than flee to safety embodied the spirit of resistance that had made their defense possible. As afternoon wore on, Elena found herself dealing with the psychological aftermath of 3 days of intense combat. The adrenaline that had sustained her was fading, replaced by exhaustion and the emotional weight of what they had experienced. She had led friends and family into life-threatening situations based on her military judgment, and despite their success, she wondered if she had made the right choices. Colonel Harrison seemed to understand Elena's conflicted feelings. During a private conversation, she explained that military leadership always involved making decisions with incomplete information and accepting responsibility for outcomes beyond anyone's complete control. Elena's choices had been vindicated by results, but the burden of leadership never completely disappeared. The Allied victory at Belmont became a turning point in the broader conflict. Enemy forces, having lost their primary supply route and suffered significant casualties, were forced to retreat and consolidate their positions. The momentum of their advance was broken, giving Allied forces time to organize more effective resistance. Elena realized that their small act of defiance had rippled outward to affect thousands of lives and alter the course of a war. 6 ordinary people had chosen to stand their ground when ordered to retreat, and that choice had changed history in ways they never could have imagined when they first decided to stay and fight. 3 weeks after the Battle of Belmont, Elena stood on the newly repaired bridge watching construction crews restore the village that had become a symbol of resistance throughout the region. The strategic crossing that enemy forces had sought to control was now serving its intended purpose, facilitating the movement of Allied supplies and reinforcements toward the front lines. The village itself bore scars from the conflict, but signs of recovery were everywhere. The Hendersons had returned to reopen their bakery, filling the air with familiar aromas that helped restore a sense of normalcy. Mrs. Chen's grocery store was busier than ever, serving not only returning residents but also the Allied garrison that had been stationed in Belmont to secure the vital crossing point. Elena had been offered a promotion and immediate reinstatement in the regular army, with assignment to a special operations unit that specialized in unconventional warfare. The offer was tempting, especially given the recognition and career opportunities it represented. However, Elena found herself questioning whether military life was truly what she wanted after experiencing the intensity of defending her home. Her father, Miguel, had surprised everyone by announcing his intention to write a book about their experience. Publishers had already expressed interest in the story of ordinary civilians who had changed the course of a war through determination and tactical thinking. Miguel's perspective as both a veteran and participant would provide unique insights into the psychology of resistance. Joseph had received a contract to manufacture specialized equipment for the Allied military based on the innovative devices he had created during the siege. His small blacksmith shop was being expanded into a proper manufacturing facility that would employ dozens of local residents and contribute to the war effort on a larger scale. Sarah had indeed accepted the military's offer of advanced communications training, but with the understanding that she would return to civilian life after the conflict ended. Her experience had revealed talents she never knew she possessed, and she wanted to pursue engineering studies that had been impossible in the small village before the war. Thomas had become something of a local hero among the returned villagers. His hunting skills and knowledge of local terrain had proven invaluable, not only during the resistance but also in helping Allied forces track down enemy stragglers and secure the surrounding area. Several military units had requested his services as a guide and scout. Chen Wei had passed away peacefully 2 weeks after the liberation, surrounded by family and friends who had returned to rebuild their homes. His funeral had been attended by over 200 people, including Allied officers who wanted to pay respects to the old man, who had chosen courage over comfort when it mattered most. Elena received regular updates about the broader war situation through her continued contact with military intelligence. The enemy offensive that had seemed so threatening 3 weeks earlier had collapsed completely. Allied forces were now advancing steadily, pushing enemy troops back toward their original borders and recapturing territory that had been lost in the early phases of the conflict. Military analysts credited the defense of Belmont as a crucial turning point that had disrupted enemy momentum at exactly the right moment. Elena sometimes wondered about the butterfly effect of their decision to stay and fight. How many lives had been saved because an enemy division was delayed for 72 hours? How different would the war's outcome have been if they had simply followed evacuation orders? The psychological impact of their resistance had extended far beyond military considerations. News of 6 civilians successfully defying a much larger enemy force had spread throughout Allied territories, inspiring similar acts of resistance in other occupied areas. Elena received letters from people across the region who had been motivated by their example to organize their own defensive efforts. Elena often walked through the village in the evening, reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. The peaceful community where she had planned to spend quiet years caring for her father had become a strategic military installation. The simple life she had sought after leaving the army had been replaced by recognition and opportunities she never could have imagined. Despite the accolades and offers, Elena found herself most satisfied by the simple fact that her home still existed. The village she had chosen to defend was alive and thriving, its residents rebuilding their lives with the confidence that comes from having successfully faced their worst fears. Colonel Harrison visited Elena one final time before transferring to a new assignment. She brought official commendations for all 6 defenders and news that their story was being included in military training curricula as an example of effective unconventional warfare tactics. Elena accepted her medal with mixed emotions, proud of what they had accomplished but sobered by the knowledge of how easily things could have gone differently. Military decorations represented recognition from institutions she respected, but the real validation came from seeing her neighbors returning home and resuming their interrupted lives. As spring arrived and new construction began throughout the village, Elena made her final decision about her future. She would decline the military's offer and remain in Belmont, helping to rebuild not just the physical structures, but the community spirit that had made their resistance possible. The war continued in other regions, but for Elena and her fellow defenders, victory had already been achieved. They had stood their ground when ordered to retreat, faced impossible odds with courage and creativity, and ultimately changed the fate of a conflict that had seemed beyond their control. Elena Martinez, the former communications officer who had wanted nothing more than a quiet, life-repairing radios, had become a symbol of resistance whose story would be told for generations. More importantly, she had discovered that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by professional soldiers in distant places, but by ordinary people defending the places they call home. The bridge at Belmont stood strong, carrying traffic and commerce as it had for centuries, but now it also carried the memory of 6 people who had refused to retreat, who had chosen to stand and fight when everything seemed lost, and who had ultimately changed the course of history through their simple act of defiance.